Welcome back to the Lost Facility devlog series, and this will be the second devlog in this, and we're going to be taking a look at how I started to build out the cliffside of the geometry here. So this is still kind of a work in progress. I didn't have a ton of time to work on this project this week. It's my son's birthday, so I was doing some things with that. So I didn't get to do as much as I wanted to, but I've started to build out some of the canyon geometry. So specifically, we have the sides of these like heavy slopes that aren't super detailed that I want to take a look at and kind of add in some extra detail to. So I was experimenting with a technique that I've had in mind for a long time, pretty much since the Triplanar node came out for the labs toolset. It's something that I've had in mind since then, and since I made that initial video that I made way back when, which I'll probably leave a card to somewhere here, so take a look at that if you're interested here. But the sides of this cliff is what we're going to be working on, and so basically I think this is pretty much the same setup that I had in the last video, but I've added in a mask clear, and then I'm remasking with a mask by feature. And what I'm doing here is just taking the slope and basically just getting these heavy slope areas, the places where you would expect to be like rocks basically. And that's done with this little slope ramp here. And then I'm converting this to the height field, which if we take a look at our geometry spreadsheet, leaves us with this mask attribute, which is either a 0 or a 1. Actually, I think there's some other values in there. Yeah, so there's some other values in there, but it's basically, it's going to be in the mask or not. And what we need to do is, well, what I started doing this, I'm probably not going to do it in the final thing because I was trying to work out a way where I could just isolate these heavy sloped areas, basically what's masked out here, and just delete everything and then bring it back. But I don't think that's going to work, but we'll just show the process that I've started out with here. So let's drop down a blast node, and we'll take a look at this. So we'll do at mask is, let's do just greater than 0, and we can set that to points. And then we get just this. And then we want to delete non-selected. And then we get just these kind of sloped areas. So there's a bunch of these tiny little polygons. There's a couple like points here that we don't really want, so we can drop down a delete small parts labs node, and that's gonna clean up some of this, but I want to get rid of these really tiny areas too. So I'm gonna bump this threshold up to like 100, and that gets rid of some of those smaller pieces as well, but leaves us with these bigger chunks, which is more with what I'm looking for. And then we can just drop down a group node, and we don't want to have a base group, but we want a bounding region, and then we want the size to be like that. We can just do 1,000 by 1,000 or whatever. It's going to include everything. And then we can offset this in the X direction by half that, and that's just going to split it down the middle and give us half of it, and then we can just work on half of the geometry we want. So we'll just leave the group name, whatever, that's fine. So now we only have half the geometry, which will be easier to work with, and then we can kind of split this in half on the other side and work on that later if we want. But all I'm going to do from here is just increase the resolution here and just kind of clean up this geometry a little bit. So we can do that with a remesh, and I'm going to start out with a target size of like 2, something higher than what we get with the default settings, just to give us a little bit of a faster remesh here. And that's maybe a little bit too low res for what I'm looking for. It just gets rid of some of those details. So let's drop that down to 1, and you can increase that as you see fit. Maybe we'll go even lower. Let's go like 0.5 with our target size. And that's going to keep some of these details in here because I do like kind of some of the erosion patterns that we get from Gaia. So I want to keep some of that detail in there without getting rid of too much of it. But I do want to just make this a little bit of a cleaner mesh. And I'm thinking that I'm going to use some different methods here, so I'll play around with it more, but we'll start off with this for now. So that gives us a pretty decent mesh, pretty close to what we had before. So if we take a look here, so we had, and this is what we got. Now it's a little bit more dense, but it's still not quite dense enough. These polygons are still actually kind of big. So you can drop down a subdivide here. And in this subdivide, it's going to take a second to run here. Let's see what this gives us with this first iteration. Hopefully we don't crash here. There we go. So with a depth of 1, that's kind of all right. We may want to go even further. Let's bump this up to 2. This is going to get kind of heavy, so just be aware of that when you're working with your scene, because it can start to bog your scene down. That's why we're kind of only working with half of the geometry here. And when I do this, work on this more, I think that I'm gonna not blast away using the mask. I'm probably just gonna do the whole geometry, but I don't know, we'll see. May use actually I probably will use the exoside quad remesher just to allow us to get a little bit of a nicer mesh and lose some polygons where we don't need it and gain some where we do. But we'll see how that goes. So give this a second. It's thinking. Hopefully, oh, there we go. All right. So now this, you can see, is pretty dense mesh, and it's more in line with what we're looking for here. So now we need a triplanar node, labs triplanar displace. I'm going to uncheck this displacement and I'm going to use the color. This is just going to give us a little bit more control over our scene. So I'm going to take a look at this triplanar displace here. And actually should have just canceled it. So I need to get our texture here. All right, so take a look. Let's see. We were using I was using the export from the previous video, so the rock wall. I actually exported a second one with it. I made the mistake of not keeping it in the raw 0 to 1 range. I did a proportional export, so just keep that in mind if you're going back. Do the raw export, not the proportional. You can see that this gives us this sort of a texture, which is pretty tiled, not necessarily what we're looking for. So let's drop this down to maybe 0.005. Can't remember exactly what I used, but we'll play around with it here and see what we get. And you can play around with your liking. You may even want to do multiple of these triplanar displaces to get the result that you're looking for in the final thing. That may be too much. Maybe we do 0.15. Just trying to get the right amount of detail and tiling in our mesh here. Let's give this a second. All right, you can start to see some of this, but it's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on here. So let's drop down an attribute, adjust color. We can fine tweak this just a little bit more. This is running a little bit slow because I'm probably recording here, and also I'm getting just the chugging from the heavy mesh. So we'll enable, actually it's not post-process that I want, but color correction. And we can play around with the gain maybe. Just see what we get with some adjusted values. Not the gain, sorry, but the gamma. Give this a moment. There we go. And actually, I may not even want to do the gamma. I probably want to do just the contrast. It's going to take a second because, like I said, this is a pretty dense mesh. Let's uncheck our gamma there, bump up our contrast. And you can kind of see a little bit better what we got going on now. So we do want to, actually we do want to enable this post-process. We want to clip it to, or clamp it to 0 and 1. Which by default is what those settings will do. So get some of this detail in here, and we can always adjust this later, but let's just take a look at what this does once we kind of start to displace the actual geometry itself. So there's one other thing that we need to do in order to make this just work a little bit better. That's to add some normals, and then we need to blur them. So once we get our normals to calculate here, we do need to set them over to point normals. So we'll set them to points. Without a moment. Like I said, this is running a little bit slower because it is such a dense mesh here. We can do an attribute blur now, and I'm just gonna try and cancel the cook. Okay, so we'll set this to @n, our normal. I'm gonna cancel. I should have just set this to manual update, but it will. So we'll use, like, I don't know, you can do like 300 or 400 blurring iterations. Seems to be something that I found that works well with the size of the geometry that we have in the height fields. So we'll let that just generate a little bit there. It's going to take just a moment. Should start to see our geometry pop back in our viewport. And then we can drop down a point VOP, wire this on up. And at this point, I'm going to come down here into the bottom right and just set this to manual just so we can work a little bit faster here. And I'm going to take this geometry VOP, and I'm going to take our color channel, and I'm going to use that for a displace along normal. But this is going to be a color, so we need to do a vector to float. So we'll plug our color into that, and it doesn't matter, these should be the same here since it's black and white. But we'll just use the X value, and we're going to multiply that, and we'll middle click and press promote parameter just to give us some more control over that outside of this VOP. We'll wire in our points here, and then our displacement we'll put into our position. And then in our point VOP for this input number 2, that's going to be our multiply. We'll just set this to let's set it to 3. Value, it doesn't need to be too high of a value to displace this a decent amount. So let's go ahead and click this refresh, let this cook. And we'll see what we get here. All right, so you can see that we have some displacement going on here. You can see that it is adding a lot of detail into here. So if I take a look at our before, which you just see the color, and then after, this may be a little bit easier if I get rid of the color and just set it back to white. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll set this to white, set this to white. Let's wire this into a switch. Oops, a switch. And we have blurred the normals here, so let's actually come in here and just recreate those normals. Make sure this sets to points. And we'll do the same over here. And let's come back to our switch, and we can just set that back to auto update. And this is going to start to cook here. And we'll take a look at a little before and after type thing. All right, so we have, this is the before of our geometry. So this is what we had just raw coming out of the Gaia. And then once we switch on over to our displaced version, you see this may be too much. Actually, it probably is way too much. But you see we have a lot of detail that we didn't have in here before, and we can play around with the texture that we're using as well as the texture size, and we can get some different looks here. So let's just drop this down to maybe like, I don't know, 1.5, maybe half the displacement that we have. So we get some more detail in here, which I'm kind of liking, and maybe we want to up the repetitions here. So we'll come back to this triplanar displace. Maybe we'll set this to 0.04 maybe, and let's just see kind of what that gets. And like I said, it's maybe a good idea to get some finer details in here, maybe do like an overall displacement, and then come back and add in, you can mix multiple displacements in that point bop, doing kind of the same thing. We just need some different colors, and you can pipe that into like a composite node or whatever inside of the point bop. So this gives us a lot more detail in our little vertical areas, and then we can add this back in later, and we can adjust the amount of displacement that we want. And what I was playing around with was taking a group node and doing unshared edges to grab just the edges, and then I was going to add a color to that and just displace that based off of that color. But I don't think that's going to work too well, because when you blast away the stuff, it kind of gets rid of a polygon that you need, and getting that back in there is not the best thing in the world or the easiest thing in the world. But overall, this gives us some interesting detail that we didn't have back into our geometry, which is pretty sweet. So we'll have to play around with this more in the next over the next week and see what we can come up with and see if we can get some better results. But I really like the added detail that we give this, and I may generate some more rock textures just to give us some added detail. And I'm also thinking about how we're going to go about texturing this, so we'll see kind of what I come up with on that, because this may not work too well when it comes to getting our textures to come back on from what we export from Gaia. So I haven't played around with that yet, but I don't know, we'll figure it out. It shouldn't be too difficult to get them back on, at least with what I'm thinking. So we'll play around with all that in the future videos. But anyways, this is how I would go about adding some extra detail into the height field, the stretch parts of the height field. So if you've ever wondered how you can go about doing that, this is one method that you can do in order to do that. But anyways, like I said, we're going to be taking a look at more things and more detail on this in the next video or two over the next coming weeks here. Try to get this all ironed out so we can use this on the other landscapes that we create that we need for our scene. So anyways, hopefully this helped you out. Thank you guys for watching. Like I said, this is an ongoing series. This project file will be available on Patreon along with everything that I have created so far, including the terrains and the texture that we used in this video. So if you want any of that, then go ahead and head on over there. But anyways, thank you guys for watching, and have a good day.